Union Pacific Big Boy is known as the biggest steam locomotive ever built in the world, and debatably one of the strongest as well. Weighing in at an impressive 762,000 pounds, these monsters roamed the southwest United States from 1941 until 1962. It was also one of the most expensive locomotives, costing $265,000 new in 1941. Now, with inflation, ballpark estimates equals over $4,606,324. Yikes. You wouldn't want to wreck one of these beasts, that's for sure. However, in 1953, one indeed wrecked. And this is the story. On April 27, 1953, a Union Pacific crew were going to start out on a routine haul across the open prairie of southern Wyoming with a manifest train. The train would be led by Union Pacific Big Boy 4005. Engineer Leo Murray, fireman Lawrence Endress, and brakeman James R. Anderton made up the head-end crew, while conductor James Walker and brakeman Ivan Shiragar made up the rear-end crew in the caboose. 62 freight cars followed the 4005 as it made its way down the track. At 9:10 a.m., the train passed through Wamsutter, Wyoming, heading westbound. The morning was cloudy with a light mist, and the 0.43% descending grade made for an easy journey. The train was traveling at around 50 miles an hour. Meanwhile, about 8 miles ahead of the 4005, a section gang stationed at Freewen traveled 3.6 miles to the east to Red Desert on a track motor car to obtain a supply of switch ties. The foreman and 4 section workers arrived in Red Desert and were approached by a sheep herder requesting assistance in getting a sheep across the tracks. The size of the herd is not known, however the average ranch in 1949 had 1,100 herd of sheep. The foreman called to receive a track lineup which read that 4 trains were due to pass through going both east and westbound between 9:15 a.m. and 9:55 a.m. 4005 was due first at 9:15 a.m. After he received the lineup, the foreman assigned one section man to proceed eastward and the other westward to provide flag protection at each end of the sidetrack. After one east and westbound were to pass, they were to be providing protection for the sheep herder. And as for added protection, 2 other section men were to operate a switch in each main track which led to the siding. This would display a block signal down the track in each direction warning any unannounced approaching trains to slow down. The foreman unlocked both switches, and the section men were instructed to open the switch on his hand signal. The foreman then walked back to the sheep herder some 300 yards from the switch to tell him what exactly the men were going to do. As the 4005 approached the east end of the Red Desert siding, the Union Pacific section man opened the siding switch. But then 4005 loomed into view at high speed. Panicking, he frantically made an unsuccessful attempt to close the switch before the engine passed. The engineer quickly noticed the abnormal switch and threw the emergency brakes. Entered the switch at 50 miles an hour and toppled onto its left side, sliding down the line, tearing the rails apart, snapping sleepers like toothpicks, and throwing ballast rock all over the area. The locomotive, tender, and 18 cars derailed. The tender crushed itself into the cab, and the first 12 cars piled up behind, while the other derailed 4 were damaged from the derailment and slamming into each other. Dented tractors, dead pigs, typewriters, sewing machines, and other general merchandise the train was carrying were strewn all over the desert floor. The engineer Leo Murray and fireman Lawrence Endress were killed instantly, and amazingly, the front brakeman James Anderton was alive but seriously injured. His left leg was twisted and pinned between a wooden seat and the steel side of the cab. He was trapped in an area of the cab no larger than 18 feet high and 4 feet wide for 10 hours, while rescue workers removed tons of coal and cut through steel to free him. Anderton asked rescuers for a drink of water and a cigarette. A doctor was able to reach into a narrow opening and administer a dose of morphine to subside Anderton's terrible pain. Anderton later told rescuers that his hands hurt and he was chilling a little, but could no longer feel pain in his foot, indicating he was beginning to go into shock. When he was finally pulled free, he told a rescuer,
"He threw it right in front of us. The switch, they threw it right in front of us. They didn't give us a chance. I felt the engine rock. I don't know how many times it rocked. The next thing I knew, I felt the steam hitting me in the face and I thought I was a goner. All I could think of was getting my hands over my face."
Several pigs and cattle cars were among the dead. According to workmen at the site, some pigs provided some comic relief during the whole ordeal. Occasionally, a pig would regain consciousness and with a terrific grunt would take off, running through curious bystanders. Unfortunately, Brakeman Anderton later passed away at the hospital from his injuries. However, before he died, he provided very helpful facts to investigators so they could understand what had happened through his point of view. During the investigation, the man who threw the switch, Puerto Rican section worker Ralph Vicini, through an interpreter because he could not speak English very well, said the foreman had shown him how to operate the switch, and when the foreman walked back to the sheep herder, it was the foreman who left the switch in the open position, not him. However, it was later determined this was impossible, because the open switch would have displayed a signal to the oncoming 4005, providing enough time to stop safely. The Union Pacific and Interstate Commerce Commission officials reached the conclusion that Kenneth M. Mayfield, the foreman, and Ralph Vicini, the section worker who was working with the Union Pacific for only 1 hour and 20 minutes, were both responsible for the accident. There were considerable variances between both their stories, each blaming the other, but the ICC, Union Pacific, and local officials still investigated through them. A meeting, closed to the public and press, was held to determine how the accident occurred and who was responsible. The Sweetwater County Coroner's jury found Mayfield guilty of negligence for putting an irresponsible, inexperienced man in control of the switch. Section worker Vicinity, who was found responsible for throwing the switch onto a side track, was presumed fired by Union Pacific. As for 4005, it was sent to the UP's Cheyenne facility to be rebuilt and returned to service. It is possible a different tender was used for the rebuild. It was retired in 1962 along with its siblings and was donated to the Forney Transportation Museum in Denver, Colorado, where it still stands today on static display. And looking at the engine, you would have never known it was involved in such a catastrophic wreck. But 67 years later, the story of the wreck of 4005 will certainly never be forgotten.